OMW, on my way to you. Good at what I do, I'm OMW.
Hi everyone, it's Kim Asher, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Offshore Banter. Welcome back if it's not your first time. If it's your first time, hello. Today we're going to start with my grandmother, 96 years old, still alive, 97 in 2 months' time. And she grew up in a world before electricity had arrived. And that's our starting point, and we're going to build up from there, right? So she grew up in Glasgow in Scotland, and as a little girl, somebody would go around at night and they would have to light all of the street lighting by hand to ignite it because it was gas powered. And in her home, the main source of heat was coal. The lighting at night was gas lanterns, all that kind of stuff, right? So still within living memory in the Western world, a lot of it is pre-electricity. And no one she knew, none of her neighbors, no one had electricity going into their homes. And I'm sitting here right now with Daisy. I'll tell you about Daisy. Daisy is amazing. I built Daisy last week. This is the first video I'm recording using Daisy. Daisy is my new rig, as they say, as a gamer chick. I'm using the lingo. Daisy is a PC that I built last week. Daisy, if I took Daisy back 50 years ago, she could have run the universe. She certainly could have run the planet. It's astonishing how much power Daisy has. I'll put a little insert video to show you what Daisy's like. Hi Daisy, good morning. Oh, beautiful. She's beautiful. Love Daisy. So I could sit here and give you a whole string of statistics about Daisy, you know, how many gigabytes, terabytes, megahertz, gigahertz, all of that kind of stuff. But put it this way, like seriously, Daisy is a monster as a high-end gaming PC that I built myself, and I've got 30 years of experience with computers, and more than that actually. Started building them or tinkering with them when I was about 13 or 14 years old. So almost 4 decades of experience tinkering with computers. And I've got to the stage now where, you know, I build a high-end gaming rig for myself, and it's like, what on earth have I just built? This monster. And actually, for the last 10 or so years, I haven't even had a desktop PC. I've always worked off laptops. I've customized the laptops as much as I can. But to have a desktop rig again, oh my goodness, the raw power is unbelievable. So 100 years ago, in a lot of the Western world, it was pre-electricity. And even in today's world, my understanding is there's about something like 1 billion people on the planet. About 13-15% of the human race are still pre-electricity. So we still haven't finished rolling out electricity around the world, even at the basic level of having a light bulb, let alone lighting and air conditioning and fiber optic cable and Wi-Fi networks and all of that kind of stuff. So we're still not there, even at the most basic fundamental level of technological advancement in many ways. 1 billion people, that's a lot of people that wouldn't even have the chance to know what this podcast is, or have any equipment that can handle it. So 30 years ago, I started my professional career. About 30 years ago, I finished my first degree and went into my first serious professional role. And that was as a cybernetic theorist, pre-dot-com crash. Now, there's probably going to be some of my audience that don't know what the dot-com crash was. Back in the mid to late 90s, okay, so digital technology was becoming a thing. It was an emergent technology that hadn't really manifested. This is a world that most people still didn't have cell phones, mobile phones. Most people didn't know or have any access to any kind of internet or networking. A lot of houses didn't have a computer, all of that kind of stuff. And this technology was starting to become more widespread, and companies and government agencies even were looking at throwing a lot of money into startup ventures to see what could be done with it, how we could use this technology. And what tends to happen, and it's a cyclical market, it happens all the time, like the investment people, finance people, get over enthusiastic about things, throw money in every single direction within that narrow sector, and overheat the market. It becomes a balloon that overinflates and then it bursts, and the vast majority of entities within that balloon, when it pops, go bust. Boom bust cycle, right? And the dot-com crash was exactly that. But out of the dot-com crash, the entities that survived it, or the entities that developed and grew out of it, were the ones that became the household names of today. The Microsofts and Apple and Google and most of the Intel, all of these surviving through that era were the ones that became the really big companies. But there were a lot of very promising entities that were doing stuff that was potentially able to shape human society and add tools that we still don't even have now because of the fallout of the crash. Now, of course, there were also an enormous number of chances that were just trying to suck money out of the investment frenzy, the shark feeding frenzy, that had nothing to offer. And they were just setting up companies to get investment to make some money quickly, a gold rush mentality, basically. But I worked for one of the ones I think was incredibly promising, but it just was struggling to find a way to monetize what it was doing. The products and services that we were developing, a prototype AI type stuff, really advanced context mapping of data and information architecture and pattern recognition engines, cybernetic theory in general. And my first serious job was a cybernetic theorist in this entity. And my peers, this incredibly intelligent, creative, diverse group of people, were neural net programmers, 3D animators, and a whole bunch of other people like that. I still remember we had this fantastic graphic designer who would come to work wearing a Vivienne Westwood skirt for men. It was an era that Vivienne Westwood was doing skirts for men, and I think the first time I saw that, and I thought, wow, that's so cool. Well, here I am, transgender woman, all these years later, finally fully out and transitioned. So of course, it was fascinating to me to see that. But it was just a really big mix of people. Of course, a lot of the guys working in that entity were just typical, the sorts of guys that you'd see at like Comic-Con or, wearing heavy metal t-shirts and, sitting there with big headphones and just writing lines of code during the day and reading telephone directories at night, just absolute geeks. And I loved working there. I learned so much. It was a privilege to have that chance. Now, my line manager, who was one of the equity holders of the company, was a guy called Roy Stringer, who was a fascinating character, and I was his second assistant. In fact, not I suppose apprentice would be the term. And well, it's still quite sad. I think about it because I think I'd love to have gathered his thoughts on the world we live in today. But he came into work one day and he had like a little lump on the palm of his hand. I still remember the first day he arrived at work and he was scratching it all the time. And he was like, oh, I wonder what that is. That's a bit odd. Oh, anyway, 2 years later he was dead. And that was a very malignant, aggressive tumor that had just appeared on the center of the palm of his hand one day. when he came into work. But he and I would, travel around to trade shows, client meetings, suppliers, and to public talks that he would give. It would just be him and me in the car. And so I did a lot of road miles with him, and we had hundreds and hundreds of hours of conversation about technology, about cybernetic theory, about all kinds of stuff. It was a fantastic way to learn an enormous amount of experience in a very short period of time. Although he used to talk about Frank Zappa far too much. That was the first time I heard Valley Girl. And it was like, really like a cool song, like, Kim, stop it. Anyway, but we were talking, he told me, so this was like mid-90s, I was working there, and he told me that maybe 5-6 years earlier he'd bought the first ever commercially available hard drive, and he paid $5,000 for it. And do you want to know how big that hard drive was? It was 5 megabytes. He paid $1,000 per megabyte. Now, you could almost imagine this thing in technological terms, in digital terminology, 5 megabytes for $5,000 on a hard drive. This is prehistoric. This is like, you could imagine having a little guy sitting inside the casing of it, just chiseling into the granite platter, the ones and zeros as it span around at like 1 RPM or something, just ridiculously slow, small. And we were talking about it because I was really impressed. I just bought, I think my first, it was like 16 or 32 megabyte USB stick. And I'm like, oh, look at this, 16 megabytes. And it fits in my pocket. That's amazing. How much power is that? It was just a few years after floppy disks, had started to be replaced by CD-ROMs. And, CD-ROMs were such a pain because you'd have to spend the best part of an hour burning a CD with like 770 megabytes on it or something. Is it 770 megabytes? 650 megabytes? And most CDs at that point you could only burn on it once, and then we got rewritable CDs that you could write over a few times. That was amazing. Wow, how can you write on the CD all over again? That's incredible. And USB sticks started to become prolific, and they would start to just replace that. But at that time, so a few decades back, even then, we're going from my grandmother's childhood, which was pre-electricity, to when I started in this industry, it was 16 megabytes on a stick was the height of technological fashion. And just a few years before that was 5 megabytes for $5,000, $1,000 per megabyte. And then about 10 years ago, I was working on a ship and we were decommissioning it. That ship had been involved with a company for 10 years. It had been chartered for 10 years. And at the end of the 10-year period had arrived, and we had to clean up everything off the ship that belonged to the company. We even had to cut off the top upper deck on one part of the vessel so we could lift out the LARS, the launch and recovery system for the ROV, and every bit of cabling and like spares and bits and pieces had to be cleaned up and removed. It was an enormously large task to take this 120 meter light construction vessel, Norwegian flag vessel up in Norway. We did this to clean it up, to hand it back to the ship owners after a decade. And during that cleanup process, I found a cardboard box, a big cardboard box, and in that cardboard box were untouched, brand new, still factory sealed hard drives, about 50 or 60 hard drives in this box. And I looked at them and thought, I was quite excited to start with. I'm like, oh wow, look at all these hard drives. And then I saw them and I thought, yeah, okay. So I carried the box down to the mess and I put a sign on it saying, help yourselves to free hard drives, no more than 2 per sailor. And of course the box was empty by the time lunch was over. But already at that point people had started to trickle back and try and put them back into the box because they didn't want them. Because those hard drives were only 3 gigabytes. 3 gigabyte hard drives were useless 10 years ago. And I'm sitting here now with Daisy. Daisy's got a 22 terabyte physical hard drive as a backup, not to mention the 10 terabytes of NVMe storage. So, I've got, 30 terabytes here. That's 10,000 times more storage in a household computer than an entire box of industrial hard disks. Really, because we were spending a lot of money on data storage, and we were recording video subsea and recording a lot of data strings from the subsea operations. So we were going through hard disks really quickly. But even at that point, 3 gigabytes was nothing. Why am I sitting here talking about all of this? I want to just make us all spend a moment to stop and think. So let's just quickly map this out again. 100 years ago, pre-electricity, 3 decades ago, 30 years ago, digital technology was emergent, and cell phones and the internet and digital media like films and music and online streaming and stuff was very early. It was really just entering the mainstream. And now, 3 decades later, just over a quarter of a century later, look at the world we live in. If I took Daisy back 50 years, literally she could run the planet. 30 years ago, she could dominate an industry. Today, she's the household PC for a gamer chick. It took me a day to build her. And that was with a bunch of problems with the BIOS and trying to get the XMP enabled on my 128 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM, right? 128 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM. I think what that would have meant a few decades ago. But now it's just numbers. And, massive changes, it feels incremental, like year to year. Oh, like the 3rd series, the 4th series, the 5th series. Is there really that much difference? Is there really that big a difference between, say, an iPhone 10 and an iPhone 14? Is it that big a difference? But then, put it in context. Before the iPhone, there were 100 different phone designs. Flip phones, the clamshell style, and the slidey yappy banana one, the Nokia, whatever it was. And there was the Razor, and all of these different phones. BlackBerry was massive. And then the first iPhone came out, and then after that, every single phone looks like an iPhone. No way around it, right? The iPhone effectively has nailed down what the optimal phone design should be at this point in time. But I still think we're so far away from using technology properly. There are paradigm shifts that have to happen with technology. And, so maybe the emergence of the iPhone was a paradigm shift. Pre-iPhone, post-iPhone, digital communications, personal communications went through a massive shift. The same with content streaming online. The days of the broadcaster are numbered and have been for a long time. Entities like the BBC are a shadow of their former selves. And there's still a lot of work to do with replacing some of the old paradigms with the new ones. And that goes with media consumption, but it also goes with how we look at investment, how we employ technology in different industrial applications. It goes with how governments use technology to do different things. There's so many areas where technology can still be adapted and improved in terms of its application. And I think the point of this talk is we live in a world now where things like generative AI, ChatGPT, and all of these things are again becoming mainstream, and we're talking about an AI revolution, which I fundamentally do believe will radically change the world very quickly. And I think what I would like to have anyone take away from me wittering on about all of this stuff is let's compare it to photography, because I spent 3 years training as a master photographer, apprenticing to a very well respected photographer back then, who really was a very old school, dark rooms and chemicals and large format photography and all of that kind of stuff. And I will do a talk about that at some point because it's near and dear to me, and I think a lot of people would find that interesting. But one of the things he told me was that amateurs talk about the equipment and professionals talk about the images. And I think that's the takeaway with all technology and how we apply it, right? We are mesmerized and hypnotized by the technology. The hunt for the next most powerful graphics card or more memory or the next iPhone or the next this and that, and this desire to possess the most powerful hardware that we can, more megapixels and more this and more that. That's not where the game is. That's not the important thing. It's not the hardware we should be talking about. It's the images. And when I say that, I mean it's the data, it's the applications, it's how we interface with what this technology does, it's the outcome of our efforts. And I think we need to spend a lot more time and effort not in developing new hardware, but in developing new ways of employing these technologies in our lives, because ultimately we are just primates that crawled out the Serengeti. We discovered fire, we invented the wheel, we did these things, we built cities, we created chaos, weapons and warfare and all of this stuff, and we're still just a bunch of hairy mammals. Don't even talk to me about body hair. Battling body hair, oh dear. Anyway, so but the bottom line is, we're still that primate. We're still triggered by a lot of those instinctive responses, and yet we're surrounded by things like Daisy, these powerful technologies that are just everyday life. And learning how to use them instead of letting them use us. I'm in Taiwan, the home of a lot of the development of the hardware. Companies like Asus and Nvidia and what have you, TSMC. And I go onto the streets and around me, every single person, almost without exception, walks along with their phone like this, just staring at the screen while they're walking, often even crossing roads without lifting their heads up to look away from their phones. The technology has sucked people in so much. It's hard for us to control it and to incorporate it into our lives in a way that's meaningful. So I don't know what the answer is, but I certainly wanted to just, have a little chat about it. Look, don't worry, the next episode of Offshore Banter, I've already got it planned out. And it's back to the dirt and grime of offshore life. It's a story about a very old school offshore story from a former colleague of mine, and a story that he told me, and he was near retirement when I started working with him. It's a story from his back in the day about what they were doing pre-GPS, range, all that kind of stuff. It's a lot of dirt, a lot of gossip, a lot of grime in that one. So forgive me if this talk about Daisy and my grandmother living in a world before electricity was a little bit of a, blind avenue for you. But we'll get back to normal soon. And this is the nature of this show. It's diverse by nature. It's whatever tickles my fancy that I think you guys might find interesting. Because don't forget, a lot of this technology is used offshore as well. Piezoelectrics for subsea acoustics, and GNSS, GPS systems and all of that kind of stuff. Dynamic positioning systems. All of these technologies that we use offshore have grown out of these things. So it affects all of us, and it's worth paying attention to what's happening in the world. Right, that's this episode of Offshore Banter. So if you're on watch, if you're offshore right now, if you're at sea, if you are away from home, have a good watch. Get home safely. Be a good shipmate and look after each other. And lots of love to everyone. And don't forget to like and subscribe and all that stuff. Share it around and send me your ideas. Send me your gossip, send me your grime. Let's share it. Lots of love, people. Until next time, this is Kim saying goodbye.